G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I'm at my northeast boundary gate and I thought I'd have a bit of a chat about human Kill-ology. I'm not sure if there's any proven test, like a blood test or anything, for human Kill-ology. I first heard of human Kill-ology in the 1990s. On ABC Radio National, program called, first it would have been on Late Night Live, and then I think it was on the Health Report, and it came up in connection with interviews with a bloke called David Grossman, Colonel David Grossman, who was a two-tour Vietnam veteran who'd been over there with the Green Berets, which is a kind of a cross between a super trooper, hyper paratrooper, and, well, I suppose you could say a political agitator. And when he was in Vietnam, he became fascinated by human response to combat, human response to fear. Right? It was what he really got off on. Thinking about it, measuring it, predicting it, studying it. So by the 1990s, David Grossman was at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was what they called their professor of Kill-ology. And he'd begun with a thing called the Mitchell study, whereon somebody called Mitchell in the end of the Second World War went through the United States Marine Corps records from the Pacific and found that only 13% of combat infantrymen fired their weapon their first time in combat. It's like saying only 13% of graduate librarians can read. Eh? Repeated exposure to combat got that figure up to about 30% in the Second World War, and the Americans changed their entire system of training in order to force people to shoot. By the Vietnam War, they'd got 85% of people to fire their weapon. 60% first time rose to 85%. Trouble is, about 60% of their Vietnam vets came down with post-traumatic stress disorder. And this David Grossman had the theory that 5% of humans have 2 copies of the human killer gene, and they don't have any emotional or moral problem with killing another member of their species. And 10% have 1 copy of the human killer gene, and they might have to argue with themselves over it a bit, but they've got no real problem. Everybody else put in a combat situation effectively turns to water. Their knees shiver and shake and they fumble with their fingers, and their major contribution to a military campaign is to thin out the enemy's fire from the few enemy soldiers who've also got the human killer gene. It's considered to be one of the reasons volunteer military forces do so much better than conscripts, because the conscripts have only got the social background. 15% have 1 or 2 human killer genes, whereas your volunteer forces, you may go as high as 45 or 50% of the volunteers, the people who want to be paid to polish the weapons in peacetime and pray for a war so that they can test their bravery on the field of battle, the 2-way rifle range, as they like to call it. Yeah, 45 or 50% of them have got the human killer gene, so when they get into a battle situation, they actually shoot people instead of stand there and piss their pants. Interesting thought, isn't it? You put that together with Grossman's figures from Vietnam, where he found that 60 days of continuous combat turned 98% of participants into psychiatric casualties, whether they had the human killer gene or not. But as he said, the other 2%, they were sociopaths before they got into combat, and they thrive in the environment where they're actually allowed to kill people. They like it. That's the human killer gene. And funny thing in my mind is, for some people to have 2 copies, that means they must have got one from their mother. What do you think the women with human killer gene might be using it for if they're not out there shooting at people for pay? Pretty hard to say, isn't it? One absolute wild pluck it out of me arse type theory, or not quite out of me arse, but it's an off the wall hypothesis, is that just as the human killer gene allows people to kill each other without too many qualms, maybe that's why some people can pay for or be paid for performance of the sex act without burning a circuit in their brain, so that for the rest of their life, every time they copulate, they have to calculate what's in it for me, or what's this going to cost. That's been my experience. There is such a circuit that is welded in the majority of humans, such that after they've had a professional copulation, they can't ever have a friendly one. Never again. But whether or not that's right or wrong, here we are at the west-northwest boundary, or sorry, the east-northwest boundary. I say that because it's an L-shaped block, and we're coming out of the Endangered Species Sanctuary onto the sheep farm once again. Isn't it interesting? The edge effect. So, about the only good thing about this human killer gene is that it's being bred out of existence. In the First World War, Australia fielded a volunteer Army and Navy and Flying Corps, and we had 56,000 casualties. In the Second World War, it was again all volunteer, and we had 26,000 killed. That first figure was killed, not casualties. In the Korean War, 13,000 Australians went there for 3 years and 360 of them died. By the Vietnam War, we couldn't get enough volunteers to go, so we conscripted troops to go to Vietnam. Highly unpopular. Eventually brought the downfall of the government. We didn't win the war, but 500 Australians died over 10 years. In Iraq, 2 wars, and the only Australians who died were the one shot in the arse in a British aeroplane, and the fellas fucking around in the barracks with a handgun after work. In Absurdistan, we've been there for nearly 11 years. I think we've had 36 or 39 Australians killed playing hopscotch in the minefield, jumping up and down. Will it go bang now? Will it go bang now? All to keep the mayor of Kabul pretending to be the president of Absurdistan. It's a strange and interesting setup, but it is a setup. Now, as a bunch of my subs will know, I'm not a Christian. I'm maybe a little bit Jesus-ish. But I think the reason that Jesus said the meek shall inherit the earth is because when the last 2 violently doubtful warrior atheists fighting for the final can of dog meat where the sole remaining supermarket used to trade, when they pop up and head shoot each other and drop to the ground and start going rotten, that's when the meek, the pacifists, the vegetarians, the reasonable people, that's when they're going to come out from whatever hole they've been hiding in and grow their food in the rotting remains, because the meek will inherit the earth. The warriors cull their own DNA. The children of combat veterans have 4 times the death rate of the background population, 3 times the suicide, 1.8 times the death by accident, 1.2 times the death by illness rates. So, sayonara, human killer gene, you're on the way out. Ciao. Postscript. Who says kangaroos don't understand fencing wire and how to shift it around so they get an easy run going from the sheep farm to the Endangered Species Sanctuary, but it still keeps the sheep out? And I didn't do that, I just found it that way. Ciao.